This video is sponsored by G-Portal. Stick around to the end for more on that. Have you ever wanted to understand ARK's story? Did you even know ARK had a story? Well, it does, and this is the first episode of a series of summaries of the game's lore. We're breaking these into 8 separate parts, each deserving of their own video. So prepare yourselves to be immersed in the story of ARK Survival Evolved by the end. In this first video, we talk about the pre-ARK lore, what sparked everything, and how humanity evolved to survive against extinction. This is an area of the lore which has almost no coverage, and because of that, it's as good a place to start as any. More so since it acts as the foundation for what everything else is built on. This video would not have been as credible if not for these lovely people who helped, so thanks guys. You can check out their lore Discord here. But without further ado, enjoy! Not too far ahead of the 21st century, humanity discovered a new substance known as element. You're probably wondering why that's relevant. Everything is an element, right? To put it simply, element has this unique quality of being an endlessly adaptive material, and when manipulated correctly, it could meet whatever technological need mankind tried to get from it. As described in Extinction, the uses for it were beyond counting. Hardier than tungsten, more versatile than copper. In the right form, its ability to generate electricity and produce radiation were unrivaled. It's no surprise then that things moved quickly: impact, discovery, invention, and production, all in rapid succession. Element quickly became incorporated into many aspects of daily life on Earth, including energy, infrastructure, transport, and most deadly of all, weaponry. The discovery of the resource effectively advanced human civilization by millennia. Towns located near or on top of element veins became blossoming cities practically overnight. One of the most prized of these settlements created by said element was Sanctuary, the city we visit in-game on the Extinction DLC, though it was built later on. Despite their advances and massive leaps, humanity did not yet realize just how destructive their rapid use would become. But how did element get to Earth? To put it simply, Mark Soskin, the original writer, said in an AMA that it came on a meteor and spread rapidly, in part with the help of humans. To further prove this point, we not only harvest element from space rocks in Genesis Part 2, but we're also able to see entire planets that could contain vast amounts of it. Through whichever means, element proliferated on Earth. It contained incomprehensible amounts of energy in even the smallest samples. And this was the catalyst for the ARK story as we know it, and the violent wars, desperate attempts at survival, and countless stories of tragedy that would follow. So, what happened next? A large demand came with the discovery of such a potent resource, from civilian applications to overall quality of life. Eventually, element gave rise to transhumans, people who generally ended up on the side of the United Republic of Earth, or URE, and had augmented their minds and bodies using element, something that the Terran Federation began to crack down on. HLNA described the differences between the two sides as two dingoes tugging at the same hunk of meat, only they'd both end up starving. Essentially a resource war, though there could have been motives tied to ideology too. We have somewhat contradicting information around what exactly started the war, but it was something along those lines. From what we know, this split is what sparked a long and grueling feud between the humanists of the Federation and the transhumanists of the URE. A figurehead of the war was a legendary hacker named Santiago, or Santiago Nightmare Camacho. He designed and reverse engineered some of the most destructive weapons used during the war. At some point he died though, supposedly killed during the end, and to add to the death count of important characters around this time, a URE 82nd Orbital Strike Fighter Squadron pilot named Diana Altares and one of her squad mates, Kazuma, were killed in an orbital carrier collapse. These characters are really important later on. Now, Santiago's death seems to be one of the reasons that the tech war was ended, though the effects of his weapons on the planet were dangerously apparent by now, so much so that the two factions had no choice but to reluctantly combine their efforts in order to salvage and preserve what they could of Earth from the spreading element corruption, before it was too late. I mean, this included plants, animals, and probably geological features. About that element corruption, you see, anything that runs on element leaves trace amounts of itself in the atmosphere, which takes root in the soil and spreads, similar to pollination. This usually slow spreading of element is eventually what becomes the element corruption we see in Extinction. By this point, it had begun to spread dangerously above and below the surface of the planet at an exponentially sped up rate, due to the use of previously mentioned tech weapons, so the existing human nations needed to establish a plan before a complete global extinction event. The Genesis Project. Santiago 2.0, more on him later, describes it as an attempt to recreate everything and everyone that ever lived on Earth. The Terran Federation had the bright idea to create a massive colony ship that copied the hit game franchise Halo. On the ship, they wanted a database that had potentially billions of different people's memories, fabricated or not. This database would be carried over to the other plan, which I'll talk about later. But basically, it contained lots of memories which, the Federation and the URE weren't afraid to cut corners on or outright falsify if they needed to. So that makes things a little confusing, considering some people's memories might not be real, but regardless, along the way of them developing their cloning tech to place memories of deceased people into new bodies, the Terran Federation decided to revive or rebirth Santiago under a new name, Santiago da Costa. This is what I said was Santiago 2.0. He probably had his real memories, but the memories between the time after his death and the time he was reborn as a clone here were fabricated to aid in keeping him obedient for the Genesis Project. Santiago's purpose from then on, as transhuman and first director assistant of the Genesis Project Uma told him, was to oversee the project. As the Genesis ship came along, in hand came the Genesis simulation, a huge network of virtual realities that allowed the crew to create simulated environments of pretty much anything. The technology was good enough to test realistic hazardous environments all the way to anime slice of life worlds to lose yourself in. Why did I put that in the script? It was described as a near perfect replica of reality because of how immersive and accurate it could be. Now this is where the ARKs come in. They were first conceptualized by the transhumanists, like Uma, as an alternative solution to the Genesis ship. This started around the time when they tested prototype biomes on Earth, which are the proto-ARKs we see in Extinction, and a prototype space station called the Farm that acted as a testing grounds for the artificial environments on the Genesis colony ship. But also the Farm would go on to represent the model for potential thousands of ARKs down the road, like the island for example. Eventually later versions were headed by overseers, which were artificial managers or kind of this last line of defense for tests within the system. In other words, they tried to oversee each ARK. Now, zooming out a bit, this is where the distinctions come in between the two solutions to the humanity going extinct problem. The goal of the Genesis colony ship was to launch, supposedly from a facility called Erat Prime, and get far, far away from Earth in search of a planet that was habitable. Along the trip, they would train colonists who were in cryostasis using the previously mentioned Genesis simulation. This would prepare them for their eventual arrival. On the other hand, the ARKs would test survivors in a plethora of different ARK environments to force rapid evolution on them and prepare them for new lives on Earth. But that plan sucked because it was built assuming that the element ravaging Earth would eventually subside, which it didn't. The plan was that after it just somehow subsided, the ARKs would come down and reseed the planet with plants, animals, humans, and so on, terraforming the landscape and purging any remaining element simultaneously. But that never happened because the elements stayed on Earth and spread ever more through conscious hive mind networks that created gigantic creatures of pure element, later called Titans. The ARK project either did not take this into account or did not realize that the element would easily adapt and spread in this way. To learn more about the ARKs versus colony ship, watch my video here. The last solution they thought of was to ascend into Homo Deus, escaping by detaching from their physical form and becoming omniscient, basically, to exist in a plane beyond our reality.
I'm neither omniscient nor omnipotent. Despite the moniker, I'm not a god. None of us are.
While many became Homo Deus and helped not only develop the system with the ARKs and also being the source of the ARK's power, their intangible nature decayed their consciousness and memories, destroying the person they originally were.
All alone in a tiny room. It's cramped, sterile, cold. A bit shit, really.
All that is left of a Homo Deus after that process is a shell of who they once were as a person, only able to perform their core tasks in the system, and once they no longer have a task to complete, they kind of just fade away and cease to exist, as far as I understand. This caused them to become the shells that allowed the ARKs to deteriorate into hostile environments, but more on that later on. So here is where the story splits. First, we have the ARKs and what we could call the Mark Soskin or Legacy Saga, which covers the island, followed by the first 3 expansions. Then the 2 Genesis expansions, which explore the simulation and the Genesis colony ship. This saga, or final part of the story, was actually written by another person, Peter Fries. But where do we go next? Chronologically, we continue the story of Ark Survival Evolved on one of the Arks that has a desert-based habitat, commonly known to us players as the Scorched Earth DLC, which is where we get our first taste of the flawed, ever-looming system that ties the Arks together. So strap on in, because the rest of the story of this game is quite the ride. That, though, is for the next video. If you enjoyed this first part of our ARK Lore summary series, smash the like button below and subscribe to my channel. Also, as I mentioned, this video is sponsored by gPortal, which is an amazing server provider that I use myself to host my 12-map ARK cluster on PC. If you'd like to get your own servers, go ahead and use the link in the description below to get 10% off your next purchase. I need to give a huge thanks to 3 incredibly knowledgeable ARK Lore nerds who helped out with this video, including Chaos, Redgear17, and Stellium. Definitely go check out their lore Discord in the description. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye, everyone.